Welcome to Social Business. I'm Brooke Corty.
And I'm Peter Shergold from the Centre for Social Impact.
Ahead on today's program, why directors of major companies choose sometimes to work without pay and what they get in return. And the magic of music, inspiring, engaging and giving hope to kids who need it most. But first, to catch up on some news out of the sector with Peter. Peter, 46 giving days until Christmas, but there's been a little bit of concern in the sector about whether a new government website might in fact detract from the attractiveness of offering money to charities. Tell us a little bit about background.
It's interesting. It's a story in the telly, and it's essentially saying that for the first time, people are going to know how much it costs charities to raise funds. And it's actually an interesting target, but I'd have to say it's a bit of a long bow. Right. It goes back to the budget this year when the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission was foreshadowed. That's being created in the middle of next year. And in fact, the Telegraph story is about the middle of 2013 when there's going to be an information portal. Okay. But it is true that from that date, charitable organisations will have to put up their financial statements online.
There's a lot of concern about what that means, given it'll be there in black and white, almost in league tables, and it's been compared to even the My School website when it comes out. It sounds like a good idea. We're always talking about transparency. And a lot of these companies are already publishing financial reports. So what's the bone of kind of contention here? It
is actually a bit like the My School website. There is a concern in the sector that the statements could be misused. In other words, just because you know that an organisation, for example, uses 20% of its revenue raising funds and another only takes 10% of its revenue, you cannot assume from that that the one that only uses 10% is more efficient, because some organisations find it much easier to raise funds than others. So there is a concern there, not about the transparency. I think we all support that. But the way it could be used to put out a sort of league table about, worst performing charities and what impact that might have.
It's so competitive out there to get charitable funds, though. Is there some way that this can be changed or massaged to kind of give more meaning to it? Because I guess that was always the criticism of that My School website as well, almost as too simplistic. Yeah.
Well, I think what we're moving to is that there will be a standard chart of accounts, probably, for organisations to report their finances. And hopefully then you will be able to actually compare one organisation with another. The danger, as I say, is that people can misuse one part of the data, produce league tables. But otherwise, I think we should welcome it as, a forward step in terms of having transparency in the sector, which will increase public trust.
Also, we've seen a new Westpac Community Confidence Index, and actually it was quite interesting. It seemed to suggest that some of the not-for-profits out there are performing quite well and coping quite well with the economic conditions, which we know are pretty difficult at the moment.
Yeah, this is the first one of these Westpac Community Indexes, and I looked at it with interest. It does suggest that of the respondents, about 47%, said in fact revenue into their organisation had increased over the last 6 months. Only 18% saw a decrease. And relatively optimistic about the future. I think 61% thought that they were going to get more revenue in the next 12 months. The difficulty with this sort of index is some ways it can hide more than it tells, because if you get into the detail, a lot of the best performing organisations are actually things like industry and trade organisations that are doing quite well, social welfare organisations so-so, and in fact the organisations in culture and recreation are not nearly so optimistic about how they're going.
Also on social business, we've talked a lot about the different measures that organisations use to report on social and environmental performances. And we're getting a sense now, really for the very first time, on how they actually get used and how many people actually use those.
It's true. There's a very interesting study come out of Harvard Business School, a research paper. What it looks is at Bloomberg's data. Now, this, of course, is the data you go to if you're an investor or an investment fund to find out about organisations. Huge amount of data. We know most of it's financial, but believe it or not, there are 247 non-financial metrics on the Bloomberg database. So what they've looked at, does anybody actually look at any of this? And the answer is yes, huge numbers, 44 million hits on the non-financial data. Mostly looking at governance, that's really what seems to interest investors. Quite a lot of it looking at sustainability and carbon footprint. Interestingly, American investors not nearly as interested in that. But in terms of social responsibility, far less interest in the metrics.
So do you think socially responsible investment is actually increasing in importance?
Well, I think it is. One of the interesting things is if you look at socially responsible investment funds, those are the assets under management for people who want to invest ethically. The evidence is that they've gone up 35% between 2008 and 2010. That's a very significant increase.
How do they actually define what a socially responsible investment is as well? Because that's a difficult one.
It is. Actually, it's a really interesting article in Choice magazine last month about ethical investments. First thing it shows you, actually, is that the best performing fund in Australia in recent years has actually been a socially responsible investment fund. It's been Hunter Hill's Value Growth Trust. It's returned 10.3% a year. But here's the trick. If you went into that fund, it would screen out a lot of what are seen as unethical investments. So they wouldn't invest your money in organisations that produce weapons or produce nuclear power or gambling or do animal testing. But they would invest your money in companies, for example, that produce alcohol or mining. So each of these funds is a bit different, and you have to look behind it. I think it would be useful to get someone from the ethical investment funds on this program in the future and ask